The Confederacy found itself in a life-or-death battle for its very survival after an almost continuous 4-month run of Union victories that started in early 1862 and ended with the advance of an enemy army of 100,000 men to the eastern outskirts of its capital, Richmond, Virginia. With the support of a formidable array of large guns, Major Gen. George McClellan had placed 5 Union Army corps within 6 miles of the city by the middle of June, 4 on the south side and 1 north of the Chickahominy River, which was flooded by the rain. In just a few weeks, General Robert E. Lee of the Confederacy was able to concentrate his outnumbered forces and strengthen the defenses surrounding the city, thanks to McClellan's slow progress of the peninsula between the York and James rivers. The bold Lee came up with a complex plan after realizing that he would not be able to defeat Richmond in a battle of attrition or successfully defend it from behind breastworks. He would destroy the Union right flank north of the Chickahominy, endanger the Army of the Potomac's supply line, which was the Richmond and York River Railroad that ran back to White House Landing on the Pamunkey River, and forced McClellan to abandon his works east of the city in order to protect his crucial supply line. Lee had yet to lead a sizable army in combat, despite his outstanding performance during the Mexican War, where he received 3 brevets and was praised by Commander-in-Chief Winfield Scott as the best soldier he had ever seen in the field. Just a few days prior, he had taken up his current position following General Joseph E. Johnston's injury at the Battle of Seven Pines. The Army of Northern Virginia was a loosely organized force that Lee inherited from Johnston's 1st Manassas veterans, the initial Peninsula Defense Force led by Major Gen. John Magruder, and a mix of unproven reinforcements primarily from Georgia, Virginia, and the Carolinas. Lee advanced with his fresh army to push the Union juggernaut, the biggest army ever gathered on the continent of North America, out in front of the Confederate capital. President Abraham Lincoln called McClellan east to assume command of the Army of the Potomac following the Union's defeat at the First Battle of Bull Run, or First Manassas, as it was known in the South. At just 34 years old, McClellan was a gifted, active commander who at first won praise from the media and politicians who referred to him as the young Napoleon. He made his combat debut in 1847 during Scott's siege of Vera Cruz during the Mexican War. In 1855, Secretary of War Jefferson Davis dispatched McClellan to Europe as part of a military commission to watch the combat in the Crimea and research military advances in Europe. He learned more about the logistics of shipping Allied forces by sea there, which prepared him for his amphibious movement during the 1862 Peninsula Campaign. McClellan had grown to despise civilian command and administration of war after serving under inept political generals and seeing President James K. Polk relieve his mentor, General Scott, in 1848. McClellan initially shown the exceptional organizing abilities that ultimately resulted in a commission to organize Ohio regiments for the Union when the Civil War broke out in 1861, after he resigned his commission in 1857 and took a position as superintendent of 2 Midwestern railroads. 5 days after the Bull Run tragedy, McClellan led a small force to 2 minor wins in June and July of that year, securing control of a large portion of the area that would later become the Union state of West Virginia. These victories led to the call being sent to Washington. D.C. few onlookers knew that McClellan had been conspicuously absent from the field for a large portion of the action in Western Virginia, letting his subordinates make important decisions on the battlefield. Nevertheless, McClellan was a brilliant and careful planner who shaped the Army of the Potomac into a sizable, disciplined fighting force. When he eventually led it on a campaign, he had the undying love and loyalty of his soldiers. The honeymoon came to an end when McClellan's weaknesses became apparent as the fall days passed and the Army of the Potomac did nothing to push off Confederate outposts 25 miles from Washington. He continuously exaggerated the size of the enemy forces facing him, citing these faulty estimates as justification for inaction. His sluggishness, conceit, and political beliefs poisoned the relationship between the Army and the Lincoln administration that lasted for nearly 3 years. When newspapermen, radical Republicans, and abolitionists started criticizing McClellan's inaction in the fall of 1861, he made no secret of his deep disdain for them. He privately betrayed his contempt for Lincoln. When McClellan landed on the peninsula and started his march in April 1862, the majority of Northerners were not aware of the growing mistrust between the administration and the Army commander. He had the strategic initiative and a nearly 4-to-1 edge over his opponent at that time, thanks to his amphibious turning movement, but McClellan stopped offensive activities almost immediately. He chose to conduct a month-long siege of Yorktown rather than breach the Confederate defenses, which were undermanned. He devoted much of his time to sending countless telegrams to the War Department, complaining about the wet roads, the enemy, which now numbered 200,000 men, and his urgent need for more men and supplies. By improving Richmond's defenses, concentrating his forces by calling Major Gen. Thomas "Stonewall" Jackson and his men back to Richmond from the Shenandoah Valley, and sending Gen. J.D.B. Stuart on a cavalry reconnaissance on June 12 to find McClellan's right flank, Lee was acting with his usual dispatch. Stuart discovered the enemy flank dangling in midair, unanchored by any hills or bodies of water. Jackson said he would require even more men to mount such an offensive and hold any captured ground, so Lee decided to return the entire 24,000-man force to Richmond instead of sending 3 full brigades to bolster Jackson's Valley Army for a potential new offensive toward Washington. By mid-June, McClellan had finally moved his 94,000 effectives to the city's gates, after spending nearly a month sitting quietly on the outskirts of Richmond following 7 Pines. With 27,000 soldiers, Gen. John Porter's V Corps was stationed north of the Chickahominy, on high ground with a view of the tiny village of Mechanicsville. Meanwhile, those of Gens, a total of 67,000 men, including William Franklin, Edwin Sumner, Erasmus Keyes, and Samuel Heintzelman, stayed south of the river. McClellan's goal now was to move somewhat further west, seize Old Tavern on the 9-mile road, entrench, and start a traditional siege because he thought his army was outnumbered. The war would be won when Richmond fell. Allen Pinkerton, McClellan's intelligence chief, was a poor intelligence officer but a skilled railroad detective. In June 1862, he estimated that there were at least 180,000 Confederates in and near Richmond, and McClellan believed him. Lee convinced Confederate President Jefferson Davis that McClellan would deploy his enormous army to conduct a war of outposts. Advancing inexorably from position to position as his large siege guns battered Richmond into ruins, in order to gain permission to launch his audacious but dangerous counteroffensive. Lee presented a complex plan that would transfer 3/4 of his army north of the river under cover of darkness, leaving 23,000 defenders to repel McClellan's main force south of the river in the event that he learned of Lee's plans and attacked the capital. Lee thought the stakes were high enough to justify the risk, given the seriousness of the situation. The government was getting ready to leave Richmond if necessary. Maneuver was a key component of Lee's strategy. Jackson would covertly return from the valley, as instructed by Lee on June 16, and move southeastward, avoiding the enemy's alleged right flank close to Beaver Dam Creek's headwaters, with Stuart's 2,000 troops protecting his left. Jackson would still be at least 7 miles away from Lee's main army when he arrived in the region. In order to contact Jackson when he arrived at the Brook Turnpike, Brig. Gen. Lawrence Branch's brigade of Major Gen. Ambrose Powell Hill's division marched up the Chickahominy early on June 26 to the river crossing at Half Sink. Branch would then dismiss any danger to Jackson's right and lead his brigade down the river in a parallel path with Jackson's soldiers after alerting Hill of Jackson's position. Hill would take his other 5 brigades, totaling 11,000 men, across the Chickahominy at Meadow Bridge, turn around, and head east toward Mechanicsville, 2 miles away, once he was positive that Branch and Jackson were moving. The divisions of Major Gens would be able to cross the Mechanicsville Bridge once Hill's soldiers had passed through that city. Longstreet backed up Jackson and D.H., while Daniel Harvey Hill and James Longstreet, who would be waiting with Lee at the Mechanicsville Bridge immediately south of the Chickahominy, would cross and fall in behind the rushing Confederate tide. Hill in favor of A.P. Hill. Porter would have to leave his position to prevent encirclement and destruction as massive enemy columns advanced on his front, flank, and rear. Lee's plan implied that no significant conflict would occur until Union forces east of Beaver Dam Creek had been driven out of their positions. Lee did not want any further attacks on well-established enemy positions following the slaughter at Seven Pines. Lee's approach was fraught with serious dangers. First of all, Confederate engineers had scouted the impressively strong defensive position that Porter's V Corps occupied weeks earlier and found to be nearly impregnable. A mile east of Mechanicsville, Beaver Dam Creek, a tributary of the Chickahominy, ran north-south through a broad, deep gulf that was waist-deep in some parts. Porter's men had created strong abatis out of the trees and dense underbrush that covered both banks. 6 Union batteries totaling 32 guns were positioned in earthen parapets to encircle any possible approaches on the broad plain on the west side of the creek. In addition to the inherent challenges, McClellan had enormous manpower reserves at his disposal. Northeast of the settlement, along Old Church Road, 5 regiments of riflemen from Brig. Gen. John Reynolds's brigade of Brig. Gen. George McCall's 8,000-man Pennsylvania Reserve Division were stationed to defend 60-foot-high slopes east of Beaver Dam Creek in a roughly north-south line. Brig. Gen. Truman Seymour's brigade was positioned on their left, occupying the high ground east of the stream and north and south of Ellerson's Mill, about north of Cold Harbor Road. The mill race and deep pond of the grist mill created natural obstacles for any forces moving eastward. The brigade of Brig. Gen. George Meade was placed in reserve behind them. Brig. Gens. Porter's other 2 divisions. Nearly 20,000 troops, George Morrill and George Sykes, formed an L-shaped line to the east and south of McCall's division. Lee would only have the 4 tiny divisions of Major Gens. If he sent 6 of his 10 divisions north of the Chickahominy, Benjamin Huger and John Magruder departed to protect the city. Lee was jeopardizing his capital, his army, and possibly even the existence of his nation. He was using a traditional Napoleonic strategy of dividing his force to obtain an edge at a crucial moment. However, fewer than 7 miles from the capital of his own nation, Bonaparte himself could have objected to attacking a highly manned defensive position atop a rain-soaked river supported by enormous siege guns. When McClellan told Lincoln that he truly favored fighting Lee over Joseph E. Johnston, he was once again wildly underestimating his opponent. Events would soon test the veracity of McClellan's assertions that Lee was cautious and weak under grave duty, lacking in moral integrity when pressured by great responsibilities, and likely to be hesitant and irresolute in action. The early arrival of Jackson was crucial to the success of Lee's scheme. On the evening of the 22nd, Jackson rode nonstop for 14 hours, reaching the capital for an afternoon session with Lee, Longstreet, and the two hills after his strengthened Valley Army had started the 100-mile journey to Richmond on June 18, first by rail, then on foot. Major Robert Dabney, Jackson's chief of staff, was tasked with maintaining Jackson's column's steady progress while Jackson was away, but he was unable to do so. Poor staff work, muddy roads, straggling, and inaccurate maps all hindered the column's progress. The Valley veterans were obviously exhausted after trekking over 500 kilometers in less than 2 months and fought 6 small conflicts. As soon as the discussion was complete, Jackson rode back and joined his troops, which had already arrived at Beaver Dam Station, 30 miles from Beaver Dam Creek in Hanover County. Jackson was disappointed to find that only the spearhead of his army was there. The remainder of the force was spread out over 15 miles to the northwest, on muddy roads that were punctuated by swollen waterways. Jackson, who was psychologically and physically exhausted, had just 48 hours to transport his entire army to its designated location 30 miles away, close to Richmond, in order to meet Lee's deadline. Jackson was instructed by Lee's General Order No. 75 to stay the following night at some convenient point west of the Virginia Central Railroad before departing for his target, Pole Green Church near Hundley's Corner northeast of Richmond, at 3 in the morning on June 26. On the morning of the 26th, Jackson was to inform Branch of his position and proceed with his advance when he crossed the railroad. There was no explicit reference to or location for an expected conflict in any of Lee's vague directives. The June 25 march proved to be quite difficult due to the severe heat and unfavorable weather. At sunset, Jackson and his men reached the area west of Ashland, 6 miles short of Slash Church, their target. In preparation for the march the following day, Stuart and his 2,000 cavalrymen arrived that evening with a 3-gun battery to place on Jackson's left. Jackson promised Lee that he would have his troops on the road by 2:30 a.m. to make up the 6-mile difference. Jackson was feverishly unwell, had hardly slept 8 hours in the last 4 days, and looked nothing like the vivacious tactician of the just completed Valley battle by sunrise on June 26, although brig. John Bell Hood's Texas Brigade and brig. Gen. William Whiting's lead division left on schedule. Jackson's main force, which included of 9 artillery batteries and 7 infantry brigades, did not begin operations until well after 8 a.m. Due to the lack of fresh water in the Ashland region, soldiers were forced to hunt the countryside for springs or wells, while food and ammunition carts slowed down and were unable to keep up. Jackson did his utmost to move his soldiers ahead once the Confederate column was finally on the road, but he was hampered by one delay after another. The men moved ahead on unpaved, muddy roads 4 2/4. Column frequently stopped due to reports of enemy sightings and their very poor maps. 6 hours behind schedule, the column arrived at the Virginia Central Railroad at roughly 9 a.m. after winding along Ashcake Road past Slash Church. Jackson dutifully sent a mounted courier to Branch to let him know where he was, had a little dinner with his soldiers, and then continued the march. In a fatal error, the inexperienced Branch neglected to deliver Jackson's word to AP as directed, Hill. Instead, a large force of Union cavalry and pickets met Branch and his North Carolinians as they marched downriver on Jackson's right after receiving the news. A fierce battle broke out. Branch would be too late to participate in any activities that day near Mechanicsville because of the delay. Along parallel paths, Jackson's and Ewell's columns persisted in their laborious advance. Jackson and Ewell were off the railroad by 10 in the morning. 3/4 of a mile past the trains, Ewell took the lead and turned right, heading south toward Shady Grove Church. Jackson went another mile before making a right turn toward Pole Green Church. Jackson's advance was further slowed by enemy sniper fire, ruined bridges, and improvised roadblocks. The Valley Army was now 2 miles past the railroad and moving forward. According to a second memo, Jackson wrote Branch at 10 in the morning, which Branch once more neglected to relay to other commanders. All of Jackson's correspondence with members of the Army of Northern Virginia that day was contained in the 2 dispatches. Hood's Texans engaged in a fierce combat with Union cavalry near Potomac Creek around 3 p.m., and they later had to rebuild the bridge after the Federals' withdrawal destroyed it. After traveling 16 grueling kilometers, Jackson reached his goal, Pole Green Church, which is next to Hundley's Corner. At approximately 5:00 p.m., Jackson realized that something was seriously wrong at Hundley's Corner, as he saw no other people there, civilian or military. 3 miles to the south, the sound of gunshots indicated that some sort of engagement was taking place. With their rear guard 5 miles behind, Jackson's and Ewell's forces were still dispersed along 2 separate roads. None of the soldiers in the rear element could hear the noises of fighting coming from the south. There had been no news from Lee. Jackson believed that he had followed his orders and was prepared to participate in any additional push into Cold Harbor, which he recognized as Lee's movement's ultimate goal. Major Dabney, his assistant, remembered, Jackson seemed to me nervous and confused. My hypothesis was and still is that he was constantly hoping and waiting for a clear signal from Lee, and that after arriving at Hundley's Corner without any clear orders, he decided the risk was too great to continue. Lee had mapped Jackson's advance using a flawed map that put Pole Green Church close to Beaver Dam Creek's headwaters. Assuming that Jackson's approach would frighten Porter enough that the Union general would withdraw without engaging in combat. But in reality, the church was over 3 miles north of the northern edge of the creek. Jackson was unable to remove Porter from his work at Hundley's Corner. Jackson did not inform Lee or anybody else that his army had arrived, instead ordering his soldiers into a semi-ready bivouac. Jackson's omission to notify Lee of his presence at Hundley's Corner, with over 3 hours of daylight left, and the sounds of conflict intensifying to the south, was an odd oversight, particularly for one of the Confederacy's most aggressive and seasoned battlefield commanders. Jackson's former classmate from West Point, A.P. Hill, became impatient about 3 p.m. after not hearing back from Jackson or Branch. He later noted that any delay would hazard the failure of the entire plan, because Richmond was in danger. The invariably combative Hill crossed the Chickahominy and launched Lee's onslaught on his own initiative. Hill reasoned that by the time he made contact, Jackson would undoubtedly be there. The 2,000-man brigade of untested Virginians led by Brig. Gen. Charles Field was followed by those of Brig. Gens. Maxcy Gregg, Dorsey Pender, Joseph Anderson, and James Archer crossed Meadow Bridge and quickly pushed enemy pickets away from Hill. Hill's troops were pursuing the Federals as they started to retreat toward Mechanicsville, a small crossroads group of houses that were out in the open surrounded by tilled fields. In order to cover Hill's main advance, which was now rushing across the wide fields in the direction of Mechanicsville, Pender's and Gregg's brigades pivoted to the right. A Union battery with 6 guns opened fire east of the hamlet, severely wounding Field's vanguard's troops. Sharpshooters concealed behind a ridge also opened fire. Observing Confederate troops moving through the Shell Street settlement from the hills south of the river close to the Mechanicsville Bridge, Lee said, "Those are A.P. Lee had not planned for any significant combat to occur at Mechanicsville. But here was Hill, battling his way eastward against more formidable opposition than he had anticipated." Lee gave Major Gens an order right away, Longstreet, James, and D.H. Hill, to activate their divisions. Lee went with D.H. Longstreet's division, trailed Hill's forces as they crossed the Chickahominy and continued along the Mechanicsville Turnpike. A.P., when Lee arrived and saw, much to his dismay, that Hill had assaulted without Jackson, his forces were securing Mechanicsville. Two-thirds of his army north of the river, battle joined, Union forces advancing east of Mechanicsville behind Beaver Dam Creek, and Richmond essentially undefended. Lee found himself in a very challenging position. Lee was adamant about avoiding a confrontation with the Federals, but he concluded that the assault had to go on. President Jefferson Davis and his party are now present to see the battle as the sun begins to set. In anticipation of Jackson's brief appearance, Hill led 3 complete brigades, Anderson, Archer, and Field, eastward with the intention of striking hard at Porter's right. With a single artillery piece supporting them, Anderson's forces advanced obliquely in that direction and took up position north of Old Church Road. On Anderson's right, Archer's brigade trailed behind and positioned themselves along Old Church Road. Field then positioned his brigade south of Old Church Road, on Archer's right. Branch, Pender, and Gregg did not commit. McCall's cannons on the high land behind Beaver Dam Creek started fire as Hill's men moved forward in lines of combat, splitting their focus between the infantry lines that were approaching and a few Confederate batteries that were quickly silenced with significant casualties. McCall's forces readied themselves for battle as the Confederates advanced toward the creek and down the slope. "Look at them, lads, in the swamp there. They are as thick as flies on gingerbread," Reynolds said as he rode along the line, pointing out targets to his Pennsylvania regulars. One Pennsylvania soldier recalled his major telling him and his fellows to give them hell or get it ourselves. His riflemen opened fire after waiting until the attacking line was within 100 yards. Fire low, fire low. The enemy charged bayonets on us 3 times, but we cut them down, recalled a private from Pennsylvania. I fired until I could hardly hold my gun in my hands due to its extreme heat. At around 3 p.m., the enemy's lines were formed in my front, and the skirmishers rapidly advanced, delivering their fire as they approached our lines, McCall later said of the assault, adding, "We piled them up by the hundreds, making a perfect bridge across the swamp." My artillery and a rather widespread musketry barrage responded to them. The 2nd Regiment's constant fire crushed the Georgians as they charged with full force against them. The regiment's commander promptly sent 7 or 8 of the prisoners they had captured to the rear. Color Bearer Martin Ledbetter of the 5th Alabama Battalion said, "We fought under many disadvantages. Under intense fire, we struggled to make our way through the tangle of treetops, saplings, vines, and every other possible obstacle. Within an hour, hundreds of Confederate soldiers were dead and injured, covering the area west of Beaver Dam Creek. Hapless, bereaved, and blind to danger, A.P. Hill stood in the center of the fighting, pushing his men forward by personal example as it raged along the mile-long front on both sides of Old Church Road. However, he was unable to challenge the enemy's guns by using the concentrated firepower of his division's 9 artillery batteries. The men of the 2nd Pennsylvania experienced some anxiety as some of Anderson's 35th Georgia Infantry bravely battled their way across the 12-foot-wide creek and formed a sort of beachhead on the far left, despite the fading fire. When some of Reynolds's infantrymen ran out of ammunition, McCall sent forward 2 new regiments, the 4th Michigan and 14th New York of Brig. Gen. Charles Griffin's brigade. One Union officer who faced the Georgians recalled, "At one time, they attacked our right and center at the same time, boldly pressing on their flags until they nearly met ours, when the fighting became of the most desperate character, the flags rising and falling as they were surged to and fro by the contending parties." Meade also raised his 4 regiments to the line. The troops of the 35th Georgia were forced to defend their limited area of conquered territory against infantry fire and close-range, double-shotted canister fire from opposing cannon. Although the troops of the 14th and 49th Georgia regiments made a valiant effort to rally around their fellow soldiers, they were forced to retreat with terrible casualties. Later, under cover of darkness, the 35th Georgia survivors fell back across the creek without reinforcements or ammo resupply. As they approached, the troops of Archer's and Field's brigades on their right suffered greatly from the withering storm of shot and shell, loading, and firing. The Union line was barely breached by either brigade. 3 of AP a little after 6 p.m. Lee made the decision to deploy another of Hill's brigades to test the Federal left near Ellerson's Mill after his brigades stalled in front of the Union center and right, and there was still no sight of Jackson. Pender's brigade, assisted by a DH brigade, was given the task. Hill's division, led by Brig. Gen. Roswell Ripley, had entered the field. When the divisions of DH, by the time Hill and Longstreet arrived, Lee had too little daylight left and too much chaos to properly deploy and use them. Leading his exposed battalions across the wide plateau and down the slope into the creek was Pender, one of the Confederacy's most promising young officers, who was promoted to brigadier by Davis for his deeds at Seven Pines. More than a dozen Union cannons and assisting infantry fire stung his 4 North Carolina regiments, as well as a battalion of Virginians and Arkansans as they approached Ellerson's Mill. Boldly, a single Virginia artillery advanced and was destroyed, losing 42 of 92 men. A more hopeless charge was never entered upon. Confederate Colonel Porter Alexander wrote of the deadly advance. The enemy defenders positioned above Ellerson's Mill were directly confronted by Ripley's 2nd Arkansas Battalion when they advanced as skirmishers in Pender's front. The 48th Georgia and 3rd North Carolina advanced on the left, while 2 of his regiments, the 44th Georgia and 1st North Carolina, assaulted on Pender's right. After a time, a heavy column was launched down the road to Ellerson's Mill, where a determined attack was made. McCall wrote later about the unsuccessful Confederate onslaught. I moved the 7th Regiment to the far left after sending Easton's battery to Gen. Seymour, because I thought the enemy could try to turn that flank by crossing the stream beneath the mill. Here, however, under the command of their most illustrious general, the reserves held their own and preserved their steadiness in magnificent fashion, never losing a foot of ground in a fierce battle against some of the enemy's finest forces. The fight was fiercely fought hour after hour, with our artillery's fast firing, which caused a terrible amount of death, continuing unabated. The walking wounded relayed news of the attack's failure as they hobbled back from the creek under devastating fire. The sharp-tongued D.H. The result was, as might have been foreseen, a bloody and disastrous repulse, Hill later remarked. The 44th Georgia reached the western bank of the creek and battled valiantly for about 2 hours before running out of ammunition and losing 361 of its 514 men dead or wounded. The 1st North Carolina lost 133 men, including 10 lieutenants, 6 captains, a major, a colonel, and a lieutenant colonel. Only 361 of the 14,000 Union soldiers who fought at Beaver Dam Creek lost their lives. 1,484 Confederate men did, with an astounding 575 soldiers killed, injured, or missing, roughly 60% of its strength. Ripley's brigade took the brunt of the losses. Griffin's brigade entered the field at dusk and positioned itself behind Reynolds in a supporting role. By deploying Brig. Gen. John Martindale's brigade to a location behind Reynolds' position, Porter strategically expanded his right flank, allowing him to protect against any enemy approach coming from Hanover Courthouse across the road. Martindale and some of Jackson's more sophisticated pickets engaged in a brief battle there. While artillery and sniper fire persisted for several hours, the infantry fighting ended after nightfall. Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia were severely repulsed in their first major engagement. He was only able to deploy less than one-fourth of his troops, and even then, only in expensive, piecemeal frontal attacks against deeply entrenched enemy positions. With the disproportionate death toll inverted, Mechanicsville was the worst disaster either side had experienced since Ball's Bluff in October 1861. That evening, McClellan sent Secretary of War Edwin Stanton a wire. Today's victory was complete and despite overwhelming odds. I'm on the verge of believing we are unbeatable. The capture of Richmond was definitely within McClellan's grasp as night came on June 26. With concentrated artillery batteries supporting them, Porter's strengthened V Corps, now numbering over 30,000, occupied nearly impregnable positions north of the Chickahominy, while Lee's shattered forces north of the river were dispersed and fragmented. McClellan led 67,000 new troops south of the river against 23,000 Confederates, many of whom were green reinforcements. Since the morning, Jackson had not been heard from, and nobody was aware of his whereabouts. In order to take advantage of the wind, McClellan had two excellent options. He could massively fortify Porter north of the river, launch an offensive there, and decimate the enemy army. Alternatively, McClellan might order Porter to hold the river bridges while he assaulted south of the river with a numerical advantage of nearly 3-1, and took the enemy capital, as numerous of his subordinates pleaded with him to do. Rather, McClellan took no action. Following yet another day of fighting in the carnage at Gaines' Mill, Lee's lone tactical triumph of the 7 days, which he achieved at a terrible cost, McClellan gave up on taking a position or attacking. Amazingly, on June 28, the young Napoleon sent a wire to Washington informing him that superior forces were attacking him from both banks of the Chickahominy. He sent Stanton a wire saying, "My force was too small, and that is why I lost this battle. I cannot and should not be held accountable by the government for the outcome. I tell you clearly that I owe no one in Washington, including you, any gratitude if I preserve this army now." Before sending the message to Stanton, a shocked colonel in the telegraph office erased the last two phrases. "You have done your best to sacrifice this army." Porter was instructed by McClellan to guard the river crossings while he readied himself for a change of base, which is another word for retreat, to the James River. The assailants were severely punished by the Army of the Potomac's deft fighting withdrawal, particularly at Malvern Hill on July 1. However, McClellan persisted in the retreat in spite of his commander's persistent requests to use the victory as a launching pad for a counteroffensive. He gave the initiative to Lee by giving up on the York and Richmond Railroad, which essentially rendered him incapable of establishing and sustaining a siege of Richmond. By July 2, the wounded but still combat-ready Army of the Potomac was at Harrison's Landing on the James River, over 20 miles from Richmond. McClellan would leave the peninsula in a few weeks. Southern sadness gave way to new hope throughout the 7 days. The Richmond Examiner said on July 4 that the almost funereal pall which has hung around our country since the fall of Fort Donelson seems at last to be passing away. The martial spirit has emerged from the gloom and disaster of the past, and the superior skill and valor of our men over our brutal foe is incontestably established. McClellan had somehow succeeded in turning victory into defeat. That was not the last time he would do that dubious thing.